This is the first part of two sections on the book of Exodus in the Story of Israel online course. Exodus picks up where the book of Genesis leaves off. The book of Genesis ended with the family of Jacob in Egypt, living in the land of Goshen. The book of Exodus begins with a recounting of those of that same family in Egypt. The names are the same names as those that show up in the book of Genesis at the end. The same God that had dealt with them in the book of Genesis, that goes by a variety of names, God Almighty, etc., also is referred to as the God of the fathers of the or the God of their forefathers. And that language is used in the book of Genesis and also in Exodus chapter 3 verse 6 and chapter 6 verse 3. One of the interesting connections between Genesis and Exodus is mentioned in chapter 1 verse 7, and that is that they grew mighty, they multiplied, and they filled the land. This is identical language to the command in the book of Genesis to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Occurs several times in the book of Genesis. And so in compliance, in obedience to the command to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, the Israelites are doing exactly that. And that occurs several times in Genesis, but also in Exodus chapter 1 verse 7. Pharaoh and the Egyptians, however, are not very happy with the rapid multiplication of Israelites. They become fearful of the number of Israelites, and so Pharaoh, the exact Pharaoh we don't know because he's not named for us, only his title, Pharaoh, is given, decides he needs to deal shrewdly with the Israelites. And so this occurs in three parts in chapter 1. Number 1, he decides, let's make them work harder. And so he forces them at manual labor in his building projects. They built the store cities of Pithom and Ramses, which we may have identified in northern Egypt in the Nile Delta region. And so he causes them to work ever more hard, and yet that doesn't stop them from multiplying. The second thing that Pharaoh does when the attempt to make them work harder doesn't do it is he decides to tell two midwives who may be Egyptian midwives of the Hebrews, or they may be Hebrew midwives that were designated by the Hebrews as midwives. We're not sure which. But he gets the two Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, and he tells them that when they go to deliver a baby, they should let the female babies live, but that they should kill the male babies. And so the midwives, were told, feared God, and they refused to do that. Pharaoh was unhappy and said, why have you not done what I commanded? And they said, well, it's because the Hebrew women are stronger than the Egyptians, and by the time we get there, they've already delivered. And so that did not work either. The third thing that Pharaoh decides to do is he commands that all newborn Hebrew male babies be thrown into the Nile and drowned. Now that is in particular a foreshadowing of the Egyptians themselves being drowned in the waters of the Red Sea in chapter 14. Chapter 2 begins with the birth of the baby Moses. Moses is born to a family of Levites of the Levitical tribe, and they attempt to hide him for a few months because they don't want to drown him in the waters of the Nile. But in the course of time, they become aware that that's going to be more and more difficult to do. And so they decide to put him in a little, the text says a little ark, and the word in Hebrew is tebah. That tebah, that word, only shows up one other place in Scripture, and that is in Noah and the flood story. Noah's big ark, this is the little itty-bitty ark to accommodate a baby. And so they put Moses in the little bitty ark, close him in, and set him adrift on the waters of the Nile. And so Moses is saved through the waters of the Nile rather than being drowned in them. One great irony is that the baby Moses is seen by the daughter of Pharaoh, of Pharaoh's own household, comes down to the waters of the Nile to bathe and sees this little ark and goes, looks inside, and recognizes that it is one of the Hebrew babies. Another irony is that she spies the little ark in the reeds that are there in the Nile. Later on in chapter 15, or chapter 14, and then the poetry retelling of the miracle of the sea in chapter 15, we're told that the Egyptians are drowned in the waters of the Sea of Reeds. Here Moses is saved in the reeds of the Nile. There the Egyptians will be drowned in those reeds. In the course of time, Moses then grows up, strangely enough, in Pharaoh's own household, the very household that had demanded Hebrew male babies be killed. He grows up with all the wealth and privilege of being Pharaoh's own son in Pharaoh's household. In the course of time, Moses grows up. His own mother, it turns out, is his nursemaid because Miriam, his sister, had been looking out for him and had designated his own mother as one that would be a likely nurse for him. So she also was brought into the household. As Moses grew up, he is aware that he is a Hebrew. And one day he goes out to see how his people are faring, and he sees an Egyptian labor boss mistreating a Hebrew, and so he kills the Egyptian and buries him in the sand. The next day, two Hebrew men are fighting with each other, and he tries to get them to be at peace and to stop their fighting. And one says to him, what are you going to do to us? Are you going to kill us as you did the Egyptian? And so Moses realizes his deed is known. One of the interesting things about these two little vignettes is that it shows also a foreshadowing of what Moses is to become. Later in life, he will in fact be liberator and judge, but for now, God has not commissioned him. He's not been assigned that task yet, and so his attempts at liberating his people and judging between them falls flat, and then Moses flees to the land of Midian, far, far away, on the other side of the Red Sea, on the other side of the Gulf of Aqaba, in what we would call today northwestern Arabia. There, He meets a priest of the people of Midian named Jethro, marries Jethro's daughter, and becomes a shepherd of the Midianites for the next 40 years. In chapter 3, God appears to Moses, who we're told was at the mountain of God shepherding his sheep. He notices a bush that is burning and is not consumed. And so he goes, as we might expect, to see this great wonder, the bush being burned but not being burned up. Then God speaks to him from the bush. God reveals himself to Moses as the same God of his fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that God has heard the cries of his people in their oppression, in their work projects in Egypt, and is about to deliver them. Moses begins giving excuses to God. Chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. His first question is, "Who am I that I should do this? I'm simply a shepherd of the Midianites, and Egypt was the most powerful nation in the world, and Pharaoh the most powerful leader. Who am I to do this?" God gives him the response, "But I will be with you." Chapter 3, verses 13 through 22 is Moses' next question, which is really an excuse. And that is, "Well, who are you? I don't know your name. What God are you?" When the people of Israel ask me in Egypt, "What God sent you?" what am I to tell them? And God then reveals his name. Now, the name of God is difficult. It's only 4 consonants in the Hebrew language, YHWH. We're not certain at all how it should be pronounced because vowels were not provided in antiquity. And so we have some rough ideas, possibly. Perhaps Yahweh. Some have misread Yahweh with the vowels that were supplied thousands of years later, post the Christian era, for the vowels of Adonai, meaning Lord, supplied with the letters YHWH to read Jehovah, although this is a misreading of the Hebrew name. Its meaning is very cryptic. It could mean either he is, or it could mean he causes to be, that is, he creates. So either he is or he creates. It is clearly third person singular. It could also mean he will be or he will create. So that is a difficult thing for us to know for certain. But conventionally, people have suggested it means either he is or he creates, although we still remain uncertain about the meaning of God's name. God tells him, "Tell them that he is or he creates has sent me to you," Yahweh. Now, when God refers to himself, he calls himself I am. But when Moses refers to him, of course, Moses is not going to say, "I am sent you to me," or "sent me to you," but rather, he is. When God refers to himself, of course, I am. When Moses refers to him, he is. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 9, Moses brings up the question, what if they don't believe me? Then Moses is given a staff that will change into a serpent, and then he's to put his hand in his garment and withdraw it, and it becomes leprous. And these are to be signs that God, in fact, has sent Moses to them. Finally, chapter 4, verses 10 and following, Moses says, I cannot speak. I'm not a good speaker. And God replies, I will be with you. Who created your mouth? But Aaron is a good speaker. Aaron is your brother, and he's a good speaker, so he can be your spokesman, and you will be God to him, and he will be your spokesman. Finally, Moses simply says, please send someone else, but God becomes a little angry with them. So several accounts of Moses' questions and excuses. Finally, Moses is simply commissioned because that is God's will. God tells him, when you get there, I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will not let the people go, and I will do signs and wonders in Egypt and get glory over Pharaoh and the Egyptians. This is a difficult passage, and in fact there are several occurrences in chapter 4, in chapter 7, and then in the plague stories. I think it's important for us to remember that God does say in chapter 4 and chapter 7 that he will harden Pharaoh's heart, but when the plagues actually start, when the plague narratives actually begin, the first 5 plagues, God is not said to harden Pharaoh's heart, but that Pharaoh's heart is hardened, passive voice, and once or twice that God hardens his heart, that God in fact did harden, or rather, Pharaoh hardened his own heart. And so, not until we get to plague number 6 are we told that God hardened his heart. Rather, plagues 1 through 5, Pharaoh's heart was hardened and he did not let the people go, meaning Pharaoh is responsible for his hardness of heart. Also, at least in one of those, God is explicitly mentioned as the agent of hardening. And so I think that the way to read the plague stories is that, yes, indeed, God hardens Pharaoh's heart, but only after Pharaoh demonstrates through 5 plagues his hardness of heart, that after being warned many times, he will not relent and repent. And so, does God harden Pharaoh's heart? Yes, he does. Does Pharaoh harden his own heart? Yes, he does. There is a complex interplay here between divine sovereignty, God's sovereign will, and human freedom, and both of those must be allowed to speak. Once Moses leaves the encounter with God at Mount Sinai, also referred to in many texts as Mount Horeb, he meets his brother Aaron, and he also gets his family, his wife Zipporah, and his son Gershom. And on the way back, they stop for the night at a lodge in the wilderness. And we're told then the angel of the Lord meets them there and attempts to kill Moses for a reason that is not explicitly stated. Zipporah, however, knows what to do. She gets a flint knife. She circumcises their son and comes and touches it, we're told, to Moses' feet and says, "You have become a bridegroom of blood to me." When the angel sees that had happened, he withdraws and does no longer seek to kill Moses. This is a very difficult passage and has been interpreted many different ways. I think that the point of the story is something like this. There is no tradition that Moses was ever circumcised. We know for certain that Gershom was uncircumcised. When Zipporah circumcises her son and touches the foreskin to Moses' feet, the word feet is a euphemism often in the Hebrew Bible for male genitalia. And so it could be, and ancient rabbis thought this may be the case, that this is a proxy circumcision. Gershom was circumcised, his foreskin is touched to Moses' sexual parts, and that is a proxy. It serves for Moses' circumcision, where otherwise we have no tradition of a circumcision for Moses. That may be the case. It may also be the case that it is simply Gershom who was uncircumcised and needed to be circumcised. Chapter 5, Moses and Aaron go to the Israelites at the end of chapter 4. They're received gladly. They demonstrate the signs, and the Israelite elders believe. Chapter 5, Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh and demand that Pharaoh let the people go. Pharaoh refuses and says, "Who is Yahweh? I do not know Yahweh, and I will not let the people go." Moses and Aaron come back to Pharaoh and say, "Please let them go. We need to go 3 days' journey into the wilderness to worship. And if you don't let us go, then the Lord will do bad things to us." Pharaoh assumes that they're simply shirking their duties in building enterprises. And so he refuses to let the people go and commands their labor bosses to double the work, to make them find their own straw to make bricks where the straw had been supplied in the past. No longer will it be they have to find their own straw to make bricks, but to do as much or more as they had before. The elders of the Israelites are very unhappy and tell Moses, "Things weren't too bad until you got here." Moses goes and intercedes with God and says, "Why have you done this to me? Why have you sent me here? This is no good." Then chapter 6, God reveals himself to Moses again and gives them his name again. "I am Yahweh." Moses says, "I cannot speak." He uses the same excuse he'd used in chapter 3 and 4. Then we get a major difference with chapter 3 and 4. The first call. In the second call, we're given the genealogy especially of Levi going down to Moses and Aaron. And it seems that the reason for the second call is, number one, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh not being explicitly told to go in chapter 5. And so that may be the reason that it's foiled. And also, chapter 6, Aaron had not been ordained as Moses' priest, Moses' spokesman. And so in chapter 6, we're given the genealogy of Levi. Aaron is explicitly mentioned as Moses' mouthpiece. And I think that is what's going on with the second call. Aaron is specifically set apart as a priest. Then in chapter 7, we have the beginning of the plague narratives. Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh, demand that he let the people go. Pharaoh refuses. Moses takes his staff, touches it to the waters of the Nile. It becomes blood. Actually, prior to that, he threw his staff down, and the staff becomes a serpent. The magicians are able to duplicate that for some unknown reason, but Moses' staff consumes their staves. Then he touches the Nile, and it becomes blood. All the fresh waters of the land become blood. And then what follows is another 9 plagues between chapters 7 and 11. The plague stories, the 10 plagues. Now, there are several possibilities for the meaning and organization of the plagues. none of which may be entirely satisfactory. Several ways of looking at them. I will introduce you to a few. Number one, many have said, well, it seems as if the plagues begin with less severe, irritations, let's say, annoyances, and get more and more severe until finally the firstborn of all the Egyptians is killed. And so from less severe to more severe. The problem with this line of reasoning, although there is maybe some truth to it, the problem is the first one is awfully severe, all the fresh waters becoming blood. And the ninth plague, darkness, is not really life-threatening, but rather annoying, difficult, but not life-threatening. Another popular way of looking at the plague stories is this, that it is God's judgment on all of the gods of Egypt. That the various things that happen, for example, turning the Nile to blood, is a direct attack on several Egyptian Nile gods, one of which was the crocodile-headed god Sobek. Others, the plague on the livestock, perhaps against the Egyptian deity Apis, the bull god. The death of the firstborn, the attack on the living Pharaoh. If Pharaoh was considered a deity, the incarnation of the god Horus, Horus, and also the dead god in the underworld, Osiris. Each Pharaoh, when he dies, goes to the underworld, becomes Osiris. So several Osiris deities in the underworld. The death of the firstborn stops that in its tracks because the crown prince no longer is able to become the deity Horus. And so it goes. The problem with this is several of the plagues don't seem to have particular deities associated with them. For example, the gnat, the plague of gnats, there's no real gnat god. And so that's a problem. Another issue is that it is only in the text of Scripture, only the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, is it said that God would get glory over the gods of Egypt with the 10th plague, not the prior plagues. Another way of organizing the plague stories is the 3 sets of 3, and that is the first 3, Moses' controversy with the magicians. The next set of 3, the division made between Israelites and Egyptians. The next set of 3, God's great sovereign power demonstrated in cosmological disruptions. And so that's a little harder to see, but maybe. Then there's a 10th plague, a sort of capstone plague at the end. Not so sure that works. 3 sets of 3 plus 1. I'm not sure about that. Others have said, well, it's the hardening of heart motif. The first 5, Pharaoh hardens his heart. The next 5, God hardens Pharaoh's heart. And yet, God hardens, or Pharaoh rather hardens his own heart in one of the last set. And I've already mentioned that Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and God is also complicit in it in the first 5. But it's not a clean break in the middle. I think that the best way of looking at the plague stories is that God fights a cosmic battle against Pharaoh, who also claims godhood. And the plagues are God's way of overturning the orders of creation in Genesis 1 to demonstrate who truly is God. I think that is the best way of looking at the plague story. And so the theology of the plague narratives is simply that God gets glory over Pharaoh and Egypt and demonstrates who truly is God by showing his sovereignty over creation. In chapters 12 and following, we're told of the preparation for the Passover. They're going to, the 10th plague will happen. There'll be the death of the firstborn of the Egyptians, and then the Israelites will leave Egypt after despoiling them or taking their plunder, and then they'll leave Egypt as a mighty host. The Passover then is instituted, that they're going to have a meal before they leave, and this becomes the first of thousands of years of celebrations of Passover. Passover is the annual reenactment of the redemption that God caused to bring them out of Egypt. This meal commemorates the various elements of their oppression in Egypt and their salvation from Egypt as an eternal statute for them. And so this is Israel's way forevermore of bringing the past to the present through celebrating the Passover as we do with the Lord's Supper. It brings the events of 2,000 years ago in the case of the Lord's Supper up to the present for us. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, chapter 7 rather, they are to commemorate and they are to respond in the future to the question, why do we do these things? It is because we were slaves in Egypt and the Lord delivered us, even though in the book of Deuteronomy it was 40 years later. Still, all of those who had been born after the events are still supposed to say we were slaves in Egypt because they're beneficiaries of the events of redemption as commemorated in the Passover. What are the elements of the Passover? Number one, the unleavened bread, the matzah. The unleavened bread is a symbol of the haste with which they left Egypt because they didn't have time for the bread to rise, and so no leaven was put in the bread. So the Feast of the Passover is, in fact, unleavened bread is eaten, but there's also a 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread that is attached to the Passover. The Passover lamb was slain the night of the Passover, and its blood was put on the doorposts and the lintels of all the houses of those who feared God. And then the Passover angel, the angel passed over those houses that he saw the blood and did not kill the firstborn of the Israelites. So it's a symbol of the substitution, that lamb was slain and the Passover angel skipped over those houses. The bitter herbs were symbols of the harsh servitude, the bitterness of their slavery under the Egyptians. You'll notice that in this Seder plate, or the Passover plate, there is no wine. That is because with a meal, customarily, we drink something. Although the wine is not mentioned in the book of Exodus, it, in the course of time, does become a part of the Passover meal, as one would expect. And the wine itself becomes a symbol both of the sacrifice of the covenant in Exodus 24, and one of the cups of Passover was called the cup of redemption, at least by the time of Jesus. Chapter 12 and following, 12 and 13, the destroying angel passes over the Israelites but smites the houses of the Egyptians, and a great cry arose in Egypt. This is as foreshadowed in chapter 2, the end of chapter 2, saying God heard the cry of the Israelites in their affliction, and he became aware of their harsh servitude and resolved to end it. So this is the image of that, the mirror image. Now it's the great cry of the Egyptians as their children die. In chapter 12 also, as also mentioned in chapters 3 and 11, that the Israelites would despoil or take plunder from the Israelites. So the Israelites took spoils from the Egyptians. They asked the Egyptians for jewelry, but the statement after they ask is that they plundered the Egyptians. Well, you know who takes the plunder is the victor. And so they leave Egypt as a conquering army, as one who is conquered, and they leave with the plunder of Egypt. This is a picture, by the way, of some of the matzah that had no time for the bread to rise. So they ate their unleavened bread and then departed with their bags packed and with their staff in hand. Chapter 12 mentions the Exodus. Now, really, it's only in a couple of verses, and it simply says they went out, or they set forth. That simply is the Exodus, which means in Greek the road out, or the way out. And so they left a mixed multitude. It may have been many that had not been literally a part of Israel, but who allied themselves with them, went up with them. And this becomes a night of watching. All later Israelites are supposed to observe this ritual as a night of watching or expectancy for salvation for all time to come. In chapter 13, we interrupt the narrative to be told about the unleavened bread and what to do with it, and to consecrate the firstborn. This is a resumptive. In chapter 12, we read about the death of the Egyptian firstborn and the eating of the unleavened bread, and now we have legislation pertaining to consecrating the Israelite firstborn and what they're to do with the unleavened bread. In verses 11 through 16, then also the consecration of the firstborn based on what God had done with the Egyptian firstborn. They're dedicated to the Lord. Finally, in chapters 14 and 15, the end of chapter 13 rather, 13:17 through 15:21, we have the events of the miracle of the sea. The Israelites depart from the store cities of Pithom and Ramses, where they had been involved in heavy labor, and take a rather circuitous route. They turn one direction, then they turn back and go a different direction. They become hemmed in by the sea at one point, and then God saves them through the waters of the Red Sea. The map here is very difficult. If you will look at any two Bible maps at the back of your study Bible, and any two different translations, you'll see that the routes of the Exodus maps that they have really don't, rarely are any two the same, because we simply don't know the route. And many have suggested that, well, it's not really the Red Sea, because the Red Sea has no reeds, and in Hebrew it is the Sea of Reeds that they cross. So it could have been any of the lakes you see on this map that all have reeds. In fact, a couple of them are lagoons of the Mediterranean, so let's call that the lagoon theory. Then there are several lakes, the El Bala lakes, Lake Timsah, and the Bitter Lakes. and they have reeds. And then, of course, the Gulf of Suez, which is the northern arm of the Red Sea. Any of these could be the location, but in all later passages in the Old Testament, when the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, is mentioned, it always refers to the Red Sea. So I think the traditional designation is in fact the correct one. The Israelites flee. The cloud of God's glory leads them. That fiery, cloudy pillar leads them in the wilderness. After a day or two of fleeing, they are hemmed in against the water. Moses both parts the Red Sea with his staff, and we're told a strong east wind blew the waters back, and they cross then the waters of the sea on dry land, except when the Egyptians try to follow, Pharaoh's army tries to follow, they're drowned in the waters of the sea. Chapter 15 then gives a poetic retelling of this, both in the Song of Miriam and then the longer Song of Moses, of the Song of the Sea, which tells in a poetic fashion all the events of the miracle of the sea. Once they cross the sea, the Israelites are on the other side, and they see the dead bodies of the Egyptian on the seacoast, and they believe in Moses and in God.